My neighbor Phil said something to me over coffee about a year into my retirement. He said he'd kept paying his union dues for almost 2 years after he stopped working. 2 years. He said he knew it didn't make sense, but every time he thought about canceling, he felt like he was, and this was his word, quitting. I sat with that word the whole drive home. Nobody talks about this part, the part where you're still paying for something that has nothing to do with money. The part where the line item on your statement isn't really a cost, it's a handhold. Something you kept because letting go of it meant admitting that a version of yourself was finished. I spent 36 years as a maintenance technician and crew lead at an automotive parts plant in Rockford, Illinois. I was the man who found leaks in other people's systems for a living. My name is Mike Decker, and what I'm going to tell you is the thing I should have checked in month one. The thing I almost missed because from the outside, everything still looked fine. If this lands somewhere true for you, I'd be glad if you subscribed. It's a real way of saying this conversation is worth continuing. Hit the bell while you're there. And when we're done, write one thing in the comments that you understood differently because of this. Just one thing. I want to know what you found. Because here's what I know now. The problem was never where I was looking for it. It was a Thursday morning, sometime around 8:30. The light was coming through the garage window the way it does in early November. Low, gray, not quite committed to being there. I was sitting on the stool with a cup of coffee that had gotten cold while I was going over some numbers on my phone. Not because anything was wrong exactly, just because something had been nagging at me for a few weeks. The way a hydraulic system nags at you when the pressure's a tenth of a bar lower than it should be. Nothing that stops the line, just enough to notice. From the outside, retirement looked fine. The house was good. The Mustang was 90% done, which in my defense has been true for about 2 years. Karen was still working, still pulling in a paycheck, still asking me what I wanted for dinner in that tone that means she's already figured it out and is being polite. We weren't struggling. I want to be clear about that. I'm not telling you a story about financial catastrophe. I'm telling you a story about a leak I almost missed. Because here's the thing about leaks, and I've spent 36 years finding them in hydraulic systems and pneumatic lines and cooling circuits on CNC machines that cost more than my house. Leaks don't announce themselves. If they announce themselves, they wouldn't be leaks. They're the thing that's running when everything else looks like it's running right. The pressure drops a little. The reservoir is a little lower at the end of the shift than it was at the beginning. You go looking, and you don't find anything obvious, so you convince yourself you miscalculated, or the gauge is reading a little low, or it'll even out. And it does even out, right up until it doesn't. I had a leak in my retirement budget, and I almost didn't find it because from the outside everything looked fine. How many of you are sitting there right now? Maybe you're already retired. Maybe you're a year or two out. Maybe you're watching this on a lunch break from a job you've given 30 years to. How many of you have done the math and convinced yourself it works? Not great, maybe. Not with a lot of cushion, but it works. The numbers roughly add up. You're not going broke. How many of you have looked at those numbers recently? Not the plan you made 2 years ago or 5 years ago. The actual numbers. What actually went out last month? What actually came in? Not what you intended. What happened? I hadn't. Not really. I've been doing what I did at the plant for the first 20 years before I got serious about preventive maintenance. I was running the machine and assuming it was running right because it was still running. That's a different thing from knowing it's running right because you checked. Here's what surprised me when I finally did check. I was not surprised by the big things. The house payment, the utilities, the grocery bill. Those were where I expected them to be, give or take. I knew about the Mustang parts budget, and I am proud to say I stay inside it most of the time. What surprised me was something smaller. Something I had been paying for so long that I had stopped seeing it. Not because it was hidden in some clever way, because it had been so consistent for so many years that my brain had filed it under background noise. There are costs like that in a retirement budget, probably in yours too. I'd bet on it, actually. Not because there's anything unusual about your situation, but because most of us built our monthly spending patterns while we were working, for reasons that made complete sense while we were working. And then we stopped working, and the spending patterns just came along with us like tools you move from one job to another without checking whether you actually need them at the new place. That's what I want to talk about today. Not about big financial decisions, not about portfolios or withdrawal rates or any of that. I genuinely am not the right person to be talking about any of that. What I want to talk about is something smaller and in some ways harder. The things you're still paying for that made perfect sense at the plant and maybe haven't been examined since. What I'm about to tell you took me 2 years of retirement to figure out. But once I saw it, I couldn't look at the numbers the same way again. And I don't think you will either. The first thing I want to tell you is that finding a cost like this is a diagnostic problem, not a financial problem. I know that sounds like I'm splitting hairs, but stay with me for a second because the distinction actually matters. A financial problem is when you don't have enough. A diagnostic problem is when you don't know what's happening in a system you're responsible for. Those are different problems. They might look the same from the outside. The numbers aren't right, something's off, but they require different responses. A financial problem requires more resources or fewer expenses. A diagnostic problem requires attention. What I had was a diagnostic problem. I'd been running my retirement the way a lot of guys run machines in the early years of their career, reactive. Something breaks, you fix it. Something costs more than expected, you adjust. But you're never quite ahead of it because you're not really looking at the system as a whole. You're managing incidents, not understanding the system. At 38, when they made me crew lead, I had to learn to change that. Because when you're responsible for the line, not just your corner of it, the whole thing, you can't afford to be reactive. You have to build in regular inspection. You have to know what the system looks like when it's healthy so you know what it looks like when it isn't. You have to check things that aren't broken because the point is to find problems before they break something. I had 36 years of that discipline at the plant. I brought almost none of it home. And I think a lot of us are the same way. We're careful at work in ways we've never been careful with our own stuff. We apply a professional standard to our employer's equipment and a much more relaxed standard to our own lives. It's not negligence, it's just that the job always felt more urgent. But here's the thing about retirement. The job is gone, the urgency is gone, and the system that's left, the one that needs to run right for the next 20 or 30 years, is yours. Nobody's going to call you at 2 in the morning when your retirement breaks down. Nobody's going to hand you a work order. That's on you. And it requires the same kind of honest attention that we gave, without question, to other people's machines. This is where Phil comes in. My neighbor Phil retired about 3 years before I did. 30-some years as an electrician, same general industrial world I came from. We have coffee 2 or 3 times a week in his driveway or mine, depending on whose wife is home and what we're in the mood to get into. Phil has been, if I'm being direct about it, the most useful person in my retirement. Not because he gives me advice, but because he got here first and is honest about what he found. About a year into my retirement, I was going over those numbers with the nagging feeling I told you about at the beginning. Not sure what I was looking for, just that something wasn't sitting right. And I mentioned it to Phil, not as a serious conversation, just as something I was half thinking about. I said something like, "The numbers are fine, but they don't feel fine. You know what I mean?" Phil looked at me for a second. Then he said, "Yeah," and I waited for more, but he let it sit there for a while the way Phil does. Then he said, "When I retired, I kept paying for my IBEW dues for almost 2 years. He said it very plain, like he was talking about weather. Said he'd been paying them for so long it wasn't even a line item in his head anymore. It was just something that went out every month. He said he kept it up because stopping felt like, and he used this word, quitting. He was 3 years out when he told me this. He laughed at himself a little when he said it. He said, I finally asked my wife why I was still paying union dues for a job I no longer had, and she said I should ask myself that question. He said that conversation about 10 minutes and cost him about $1,200 over 2 years. I drove home from that coffee, and I sat in the garage and I thought about what Phil had said. Not the union dues specifically, the word he used, quitting, because that's what it felt like to stop. Like if you stopped maintaining the connection, even a financial connection, even one that made no practical difference, it meant something was over that you weren't ready to admit was over. I went back through my own accounts with that word in mind, and I found it. Mine wasn't union dues. Mine was a professional membership I'd kept current since I made crew lead, a national association for maintenance and reliability professionals that had been genuinely useful for the last 20 years of my career. I'd used the journals. I'd sent younger techs to their training programs. It was a legitimate cost for a working person. I hadn't looked at that journal in 14 months. I hadn't sent anyone to any training. There was nobody to send. I was retired. I was still paying for it because stopping felt like, there was Phil's word again, quitting. And I want to be clear about something. This wasn't a large amount of money. This wasn't the thing that was going to make or break anything. The line item was not the problem. The line item was a symptom. The symptom was that I had kept a financial connection to a professional identity I no longer had because I wasn't quite ready to let go of it. And the thing about symptoms is that they point to something. If you only treat the symptom and you don't look at what it's pointing to, you've solved the wrong problem. What that cost was pointing to was something I hadn't really sat down with directly. The question of who I was now that I wasn't the crew lead. Now that I wasn't the man they called at 2 a.m. Now that I wasn't the one who trained the new techs and knew the CNC systems and could hear a machine and tell you what was wrong with it before I opened the panel. That person, that specific person, was done. The plant was still running. It was running without me, which is how it should work. I knew that. But there's a difference between knowing something and having sat down with it honestly. I was still paying for a professional identity I'd already left. And until Phil's word, quitting, I hadn't understood why. Here's what I want to say about that, and I want to say it carefully because I think it's the part that gets skipped in most conversations about money and retirement. Every dollar you spend in retirement represents a choice. Not in some abstract philosophical way, in a very practical, very mechanical way, because you have a fixed amount coming in and a fixed amount going out. And unlike when you were working, you can't just put in extra hours to make up the difference. The budget is the budget. And every dollar that goes to something you chose automatically, without really choosing it, is a dollar that can't go somewhere you'd actually choose if you were paying attention. That is not financial advice. That is just how machines work. Systems have a fixed capacity. If you're running load through a circuit that isn't doing anything useful, it's load that can't go somewhere that is. Now, I want to tell you about the Votech. I've been going to a high school Votech program on Thursday mornings for about 14 months now, teaching basic mechanical and electrical troubleshooting to juniors and seniors heading into the trades. I did not plan to do this. A teacher there knew my son Jason from years back and called me on a recommendation. I went once expecting to find out it wasn't for me. I have been back every Thursday since. I still don't completely understand why. But here's what the Votech kids taught me about money, which is something I did not expect from 17-year-olds. They don't know what anything costs, and I don't mean that as a criticism. They're 17. They haven't needed to know. But I'll give you an example of what I mean. One of the kids was working on a brake system, a practice setup, not a real vehicle, and he over-tightened a fitting and cracked the housing. Not a big deal. Fixable. I showed him the part, told him what it cost. He looked at me like I'd said the number in a foreign language. Not because it was a lot, because he'd never had to think about it. I remember being that way. Not at 17. I grew up in a tool and die family. We knew what things cost. But somewhere in the middle of my career, when the plant was paying for parts and the plant was paying for my time, and the decisions I made were the plant's decisions with the plant's money, I developed a kind of professional distance from the cost of things. I was careful with the budget because that was my job. But it wasn't the same as being careful with your own money, which is a more personal thing. Retirement had softened me on my own numbers in a way I wouldn't have tolerated professionally. I wouldn't have walked past a pressure reading that was off by 1/10 of a bar and said, "Close enough, it'll probably even out." but I had been doing the equivalent of that with my own spending for almost a year and a half. The kid cracking that fitting reminded me of something. He didn't know what the part cost because nobody had ever made him sit with the cost before. I had stopped sitting with my own costs because it had been a long time since they were really mine to sit with. After that Thursday, I came home and I sat at the kitchen table, not the garage, the kitchen table, with the last 3 months of actual statements in front of me. Not a plan, not an estimate, the actual numbers, the way they actually were, the way they had actually been for 3 months. And I did what I would do at the plant when I was trying to find a problem. I didn't assume I knew where it was. I started from the beginning. I looked at every single line, not to find something wrong, to know what was actually there. That is how I found the membership. That is how I found 2 other things I'm not going to bore you with because the specifics don't matter. What matters is that they were all the same category. Things that made complete sense while I was working, that I had carried over into retirement without examining, that were spending money on a version of my life that had ended. The total was not dramatic, but the total, run forward over 10 years or 15 years, was a number I did not like looking at. Not because it was ruinous, because it was money I hadn't chosen to spend. I had simply failed to unchoose it. And here is the thing. Here is the actual thing that I've been trying to get to. This is not about the money. I need to say that again because I mean it. The money matters. I'm not going to pretend the money doesn't matter. But the money is not the point. The point is attention. The point is that retirement is the first time in your adult life that the system you're responsible for is entirely your own. Not your employer's, not your department's, yours. And most of us who spent 30 or 35 or 40 years applying real professional discipline to other people's problems, most of us walked into retirement and quietly stopped applying that same discipline to ourselves. I spent 36 years keeping complex systems running because somebody paid me to pay attention. Nobody pays me to pay attention now. And for the first year and a half of my retirement, I was coasting on that, running the system without really inspecting it, assuming it was working because nothing had visibly broken. I want you to stop for a second. I mean that literally. Before you read another comment, before you let the next video play, just stop for a second and think about whether that's true for you. Think about your own numbers, not the plan, the actual numbers. Last month, what went out, what came in, what went where. And think about whether there's something in there that made complete sense when you were working and hasn't been looked at since. There is something in there. I am almost certain of it. Not because there's anything wrong with you, because that's just what happens when you build spending habits over 30 years of a career and then the career ends. The habits don't automatically end with it. They come along. They go out every month because they've always gone out every month. And until you sit down and actually look, they'll keep going out. The diagnostic skill you used for 30 years, look carefully, don't assume, test what you don't know, be honest about what you find. That skill works on your own budget. It works on your own retirement. It works on yourself. The Mustang doesn't have a leak because I look at it, not because it doesn't want to have one. That's it. That's the whole thing. I was applying a professional standard to everything except the thing that was now entirely mine. And the fix wasn't complicated. The fix never is once you found it. The fix was just looking. Honestly, completely, without assuming in advance what I would find. I cut the membership. I cut the other 2 things. I looked at what was left and I made a conscious decision about every line. Not a permanent decision. I still check it. Every few months I sit down with the actual statements the way I sit down with the Mustang after I've had it running for a while. Not because I'm worried, because that's how you keep a system running right. What that freed up in dollar terms is not what I want you to focus on. What it freed up in my head is. Because there's something that happens when you look honestly at your own numbers and you know, actually know, that every dollar going out is a dollar you chose to spend. There's a kind of clarity to it, a kind of ownership. Karen's retiring in 2 years. We're going to be in this house together, both of us home full time, which has genuinely never happened in the 26 years we've been married. The financial picture for two people, both home full-time, is a different picture than what we've been running. I want to walk into that knowing what our system actually looks like, not what I hope it looks like, what it actually is. That preparation, to me, is the same thing as preventive maintenance. You don't wait for the line to go down. You look before it does. Here's what I'd ask you to do this week. Just this one thing. Go find 1 month of actual statements, not your budget, not your plan, your actual statements, and go through every single line. Don't go looking for a problem, just look. The way you'd look at a system you're responsible for that you haven't inspected in a while. Honest, methodical, no assumptions going in. Find one line that made sense when you were working and hasn't been examined since you stopped working. You don't have to do anything about it today, just find it. Just see it for what it is. Write it down if you need to. Then come back and tell me what you found. I mean that. Not the specific dollar amount, just whether it was there, whether there was something you'd been paying for that you hadn't really looked at since the job ended. I want to know, because Phil's 2 years of union dues and my professional membership and whatever you're about to find, I don't think those are unusual. I think most of us carried something over, and I think most of us don't know it yet. Leave it in the comments. Doesn't have to be detailed. Could just be, found it. That's enough. If what you heard today felt like something you've been half thinking about yourself, that low-grade nag that something in the numbers isn't quite right, even though nothing is obviously broken, I'd be glad if you subscribed. Not because of the count, because the people who end up in the comments here are the kind of people who take this transition seriously. And those are some of the most honest conversations I have. Hit the bell too. I don't post on any kind of predictable schedule, and I'd hate for you to miss one. Take care of your system, the one that's yours now. It's worth the same attention you gave everything else.